You should be a co-host now, Sam, and be able to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Everyone on?
We're pretty good. I might be missing Harriet. I don't think I see Harriet on here.
Maybe we should wait another minute. It's only 1:01.
Yeah, we can wait.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Sean. How are you today?
Good. How are y'all?
Good.
Doing well, thanks.
Looks like it's sunny where everybody is.
Overcast in Western Washington.
Oh, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful.
It's pretty warm.
It's hot here. It's way too early to be this hot, it feels like.
How hot is it?
Yesterday, parts near the Canadian border got up to 80 degrees.
Wow.
Oh, wow. That is hot.
Yeah, I don't know what the temperature is now. It was overcast this morning, and now it's sunny and hot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not wearing shorts in the office. Don't worry.
I'm gonna mute myself because I'm eating lunch.
I think I'll mute myself in case my dogs start acting up again.
Laura, I love your outdoor setting you have there. So pretty looking.
Thank you. You should. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've tried earphones this time, but I have my hummingbirds, so you might even hear them if I get unmuted. They're everywhere. Almost a little scary because they're not even afraid of people anymore. They bomb on by. But yeah, it's nice. So hopefully the rain stays away for our meeting.
Well, if you get up and suddenly start running, we'll know why.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see. I don't know. I haven't seen Harriet still get on, but
good afternoon, Susan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm
Nice
good.
to see you.
Nice to see you too.
It's nice to see everybody. This is
Yeah, my connection's cutting in and out. I just noticed it went off twice. So just to let you know, it's kind of iffy over here.
Okay. Well, we're recording them, so you can always go back and look, but watch later.
Yeah, but I'm here, so we're gonna make sure. But I just noticed it went out twice while I got on within the last 10 minutes. So
Well, let's hope it maintains. Hi, Gwen.
Hello, how are you all?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Noah.
I think maybe we can go ahead and get started. What do you think, Melissa?
okay, sounds good. Sam, are you ready?
I am ready. So I am able to share my screen.
Yes, you should be. Mm-hmm.
1 second.
All right.
I'm gonna turn the video off also.
All right.
I might do that too.
Okay, I gotta get to the first page, sorry.
You're fine.
Okay, are you seeing my?
Not yet. Not sharing it.
All right, let me try again.
Oh, there we go. No, well, wait.
Well, you said no, so I stopped. Let me do.
No. Then it started popping on finally. There we go.
There's probably a little bit of a lag.
Yeah. There we go. Perfect. All right. We'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. All right, there you go, Sam.
All right, welcome everyone. This is our 5th in the series of webinars that Dee Rendon, Sean Evans, and myself, Samuel Beckson, are giving regarding culture-built communities. This is developing the design Indigenous architecture. So this is basing itself and advancing our discussion from site selection, programming, working with architects, and the design process. Again, my name is Samuel Beckson. I'm a principal at Cunningham Group Architecture, and I own Full Circle Indigenous Planning. Today's general itinerary is about design, architecture, cultural expression. So I want to talk a lot about cultural identity, the importance of identity, self-expression in our tribes, and then share some personal stories of design and some of the communities that I've worked with and how we have worked to develop a unique identity for some specific projects. Again, I am an architect. I work with tribes all over the country. My real goal in my career has always been to think about design from a cultural perspective, to think about what does it mean to translate tradition into contemporary architecture. Just a little bit of my background. Again, I've been working for 25 years plus with tribes. I'm a community member, and I work for a lot of different organizations.
Hey, Sam. Video's kind of cutting in and out. Your sound is. It's really muffled.
All right. Is this any better? I'll pull it.
I think it's just probably the connection or something. It's not your fault.
I will go slow. Raise your hand, and I will start over.
No.
One of the most important things to think about from an Indigenous perspective is the land where you're from. So the first question we always ask when we start a project or even give a presentation is doing a land acknowledgement. So my tribe, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe or Chippewa, is essentially around the Great Lakes. This is our what's remaining of our traditional homeland in red. These are the reservations in both Canada and US. I like to show this map without any boundaries, any US political boundaries, because this really shows that we are a culture that is broad and wide and transcends those boundaries. I'm enrolled at White Earth in northern Minnesota. I make my home in Minneapolis, so I am in my Indigenous landscape. And then if you think about all over the country, and you think about what was and what is current tribal lands, the importance of land and acknowledging that and place is incredibly important. So as we start to take away the rest of the country that's been essentially taken away from us, we see how little there is. This is a slide I shared last time. Again, it frames the way I think about architecture as an Indigenous person, Indigenous architect working in a city with family and home ties to the reservation. What does architecture mean for that? This is an image of what my neighborhood really should look like right now. This is a remnant of the Indigenous landscape here in Minneapolis. No longer works that way. Indigenous land acknowledgement. This is a movement that is happening around the country. Architects, presenters are all acknowledging land like we are doing right now. And again, think about where you are right now. Think about what your Indigenous homelands was like before the roads and the buildings and all the infrastructure was put there. And recognize that wherever you are in North America, you are standing on Indigenous lands. That's not always recognized, and that each tribe has its unique identity and ties that are incredibly important to their culture and to their future. So again, Native American design. What makes a building Native American? And that's a question that each community has to decide. Is it shape, color, pattern, decor, symbolism? What approach you take to design? Do you use traditional forms? Do you create new forms? Who is designing it? Who's part of the process? And then who's building the building? some of the key questions each tribe needs to ask when at the beginning of each project is to frame that question: can and should culture be reflected? Not all projects have a cultural focus. Some projects have a very high degree of cultural specificity. And then the other question is, what forms of cultural expression are appropriate for that project? Is it subtle references? Is it overt? Are there metaphors? And then again, one of the biggest questions is, who is part of the process? Who is your architect? Who are your engineers? Who are your constructors? Who is in the process of designing the project? Is the council involved? Or cultural leaders, the community? And then the question is who are excluded? Oftentimes over the years, many people have been excluded from the design process in tribal communities, which has left varying results. So the premise I'm going on here is that cultural identity matters. And it matters for your building, your future building, for your community, for every aspect of our culture. Art, language, traditions, material culture, and architecture, they all work together to create a strong sense of place, strong sense of identity that's unique to each of your tribes. Therefore, architecture matters. Architecture is an important thing. It's often not thought of as one of the first art forms. We talk about preserving language. We talk about preserving dance and traditions. And I'm hoping that after this series of seminars that we will all include architecture and other forms of art as part of that. So across the US, North America, there were many different diverse identities in architecture. We went through a little bit of this last week, but each structure, each building form, each community relied on the natural resources, the climate, the weather, the materials in their region. So naturally, all buildings and communities look very different, from the Pacific Northwest to the Southeast, to the Southwest, or to the plains. A lot of beautiful responses. This is an image from northern Minnesota in the 1800s, and what I like about it is that there is an indigenous family, and you can see that they are in a traditional structure, but they're starting to build another structure that actually takes on some of the architecture of the settlers. So they're practicing and appropriating a new architecture form. So they're taking and borrowing from the colonizers and making something new. And that's another thing that is important to think, is that indigenous cultures are not static. We can take and innovate and create new things. What happened during this time period also was a lot of loss in identity, both in our people, our dress, our language, and in our architecture. These are all images from northern Minnesota reservations, where I'm from. So a lot of the log cabins started coming in the age of the boarding schools, the tar paper shacks. These are things that there was a big change in the way we lived. And then on top of that, urban structure, roads, highways, the grid, electricity, all these different infrastructures and utilities started coming on reservations, making them very static. And in the 70s and 80s, these are the types of housing that were typical in northern Minnesota. So at some point over a period of really about 50, 60, 70 years, which isn't very long in the whole scheme of things, somehow we were convinced that the image on the right was the type of housing we should be building for our tribal communities instead of the building on the left. And so again, that is a big question for all of us when we think about what is the future of Native American architecture and design, especially when we control it. Again, cultural identity matters. Our worldview, sense of belonging, community bonding, all of our ties to culture, they're all part of our survival and our ways of life and things that we need to control. So control of cultural identity matters. So perception, stereotypes, and self-determination. I want to talk about these for a little bit here. So what happens when we let others define us? And you can go ahead and be offended or upset or laugh at the following images, but there's something about a constructed and imposed identity that happened over the past century, And that's very different from the traditional identity and what we can make in the future. So what happens when we let other people define us? We see images like that. We see mascots. We see references to alcohol, the sexualization of our women, mascots. We are treated as caricatures and cartoons, as playthings and toys. The girl on the left really isn't having a very good time at her little Indian party, but these are things you can actually buy on the web right now. And if you didn't have enough for your kids, you could also buy teepees and headdresses for your pets. So what does this have to do with architecture? The same things happened in design and building and architecture over the past century. So our forms, our traditional forms, again, have been caricaturized, and we're seen as roadside attractions, tourist destinations. So there were all these buildings all over the country on Route 66 and in Minnesota, all over the place, where you could go and see these types of forms, and they're still out there. Again, it's this idea that there is this iconic form, this teepee in this case, and then our architecture was reduced to that roadside attraction and stereotype. So you could drive by and wonder, have you slept in a wigwam lately? And I can tell you I haven't recently, but so again, what happens when we let others define us? If we ask the overall community, the world out there, imagine what you think of Native American, and these types of images come up, these icons, these stereotypical things that are we've been exposed to and bombarded with all of our lives. They don't really see us contemporary people, museum directors, library directors, people working in the community. This is the image that comes to their minds, and it's because of all those stereotypes that we showed before. You can see it in popular media right now. We are satired in The Simpsons and Family Guy, and what's interesting about that middle picture is that was taken out of a recent math book. So there's a math problem to find the volume of a cone, and the image that they put on it, of course, was a stereotypical, okay, teepee, let's make it into teepee, and let's further slap us in the face and put a casino sign on it. So again, it's these images of what is out there in the community, and it has to do with the way we are perceived. And even South Park takes that same type of image, that it's a jumble of all these stereotypes all put into a building. And these two, I like South Park, and it's a satire, but it does say something about where society is. And you think about these cartoons and these satires, and they would never really build it, but look at that. There it is, LTP. So when we go back to the question about what makes a building Native American, again, this is it's a roadside attraction. It's a gas station. It's a place where you can go. It's supposed to draw you off. It's supposed to draw the non-native tourist off the site so they can go in and buy their gas and cures or whatever. But let's take a look at the construct of that building. First of all, throw a couple native colors in there. Add a teepee, of course, because that's going to make it really Native American. Add some oversized arrows. Put on, remember those symbols we were looking at? Slap a bunch of images onto that box. Throw a cactus to show that it's in the Southwest. And then if you really weren't sure that it was Native American, you throw a little caricature of a Native American on there. So does that equal Native American architecture? I call this Mr. Potato Head architecture. So you take a box or a potato, and then you slap a bunch of different elements on it, and then you have a building. And lo and behold, there actually was a Native American Mr. Potato Head in the 70s. I thought I would throw that in. But this has been over the past 100 years of non-native architects and community-based design, where others have come and imposed this idea of what should be on our reservations. First of all, there wasn't a whole lot of money. There was boxes put on the reservations without a whole lot of cultural identity. But again, these are the things that happen. And so I'm going to go through a series of architectures that has happened over the past like 20, 30 years over the country. And you can see, and I'm not going to judge any of these, and these are all important community projects, but you can see the reliance on certain forms to make it Indian. The use of the teepee, the use of these forms, you know, especially throughout the country. Some of these buildings aren't even in communities where teepees were part of the indigenous architecture. And then you get to a casino like Mystic Lake, and it doesn't have a teepee in its building, so it put one up at night. Again, it's part of this idea and the importance of, okay, we want some form of identity on our buildings to make it look native. Another approach is to take pottery, to take cultural elements and sort of make them very large to signify. Another approach has been to make buildings into the shapes of animals. Another approach is to take a rectangular box and put patterns and cultural iconic symbols onto that box. Another was to take and make animals into the building, or buildings into the shape of animals. Here is a building by a native architect who proposed, you know, a feather as a building. This is a building in Red Lake, Minnesota, where there's an actual eagle sculpted into the front of the building. Then there are more, there are approaches that take traditional forms and modernize them to take the forms of the community, use modern materials, shapes to respond. So I'm going to go through, and again, some of these are very beautiful, taking cultural forms and creating something new out of it. Again, many different contemporary approaches to design and architecture based on a very specific cultural location. So these are some cultural elements of my tribe: patterns, colors, ways of life, architecture, forms, materials. These are all beautiful sources of inspiration for design. And I'd encourage you guys to think about your community, the culture, the history, all of these things. And I can criticize my own tribe because here's our Minnesota Chippewa tribe headquarters. And of all those different elements that we have to draw from, the building that was produced looks more like a Northern European kind of ski chalet building. So I think there was a missed opportunity here to really capture something about the tribe. So this brings me to control of cultural identity. So we saw a lot of examples that really were stereotypes. Some of the examples we saw were very beautiful, but control of this has to do with controlling perception, eliminating stereotypes, and exercising sovereignty and self-determination in our design. And that can happen in any project that we're working on. So who should be defining contemporary Native culture? Who should be creating Native art? Who should be portraying Native roles in media? Who should be creating Native architecture? Again, that's us, that's Native people. So whether or not you're working with a non-Native architect or a non-Native designer, the community, cultural leaders, we all have to be involved in the building of our communities, because when we define ourselves, when we base our architecture, our communities off of our values and our traditions, that's a form of self-expression. And that's entirely different than what we talked about before, which is that constructed and imposed identity, what the world wants to think about us. And we can change that with each project that we're working on. So every project that we're talking about as part of this cohort has this opportunity to take your traditional values, your contemporary values, goals, and create something new that is contemporary and responds to the way that you want to be seen and perceived. I hear this a lot. I didn't even know there were any Native architects. And this is after a project, but I was recently past president of the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers, and we're an organization that promotes the understanding that we're out here. The American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers is a resource. We have architects all over the country. We have seminars online. We have a national conference. We have members in your area, both engineers and architects, who can help you on your projects. So again, if anyone tells you that they don't know any Native architects, here is a great resource in your community. There have been a couple of very notable ones. One's Lou Weller, John Paul Jones, Tammy Eaglebo. These three have won major national recognitions and are very important to the Native architecture community. So again, the question here for us is what can happen when we define ourselves? And some of that is how you design. And so we've gone through, how do you work with an architect? How do you select an architect? What are some site planning principles? All those things. Now it's about, okay, once you're designing, how do you get that going? And you really need that community involvement. Here's a couple of different community meetings that I've led that are meant to take out and understand the goals of the community. The community should have input. Projects always work better when there are common goals, when there's an open discussion, that there is a clear vision created for each project, and actually integrating cultural values into the design process. The idea of consensus building, the idea that every community member has the opportunity to provide input, and the right people are at the right place at the right time with your architect to design. So back to this idea of diverse identities in traditional architecture. Obviously, in North America, there are many different climates, many different cultures, all different architecture that are that spring and stem from these things. My role, and I'm going to start telling some personal stories here, is what does that mean for contemporary architecture? What does that mean when I think about my role in the world, that I'm living in a city, that I'm an architect, that I design buildings, but I have that tie to the landscape and to my community and to my culture. So the question I think we're all going to deal with our projects is what does it look like when culture is carefully considered in design? Here are a number of projects that I've been involved in all over the country, in the Southeast, the Southwest, in California, another one in Northern California, outside of Chicago. I think that the thing that I'm trying to show there is that each of our responses was very different based on where we were, the type of project, and who we were working for. So I work on a lot of different project types, everything from large gaming facilities to libraries to cultural facilities to clinics and housing and museums, art galleries. So each of those are very, very different project types. They're very different in scale. They all are in different parts of the country, in different urban settings and rural settings. So when I approach a project, the first questions are, all right, what is the community? What does the community want? This is a project for the Leech Lake Tribal College that I did a while back. And what I'm going to show you is a summary of a lot of discussions, stakeholder meetings, a lot of analysis of their goals, their student mission, what it is they're trying to achieve. There's always a budget involved. There's always a people involved. So this shows the type of due diligence that Dee and Sean and myself and architects do when we start to look at a project. We start to get the ground information first. We don't just start drawing. Sometimes we do. We can't help ourselves, so we just start drawing. But it has to be based on something important that the community wants. Again, we had multiple cultural meetings. We met with student groups. We asked the community, what did you want to convey in this building? And the school itself had its own values. The culture wanted to show its values. So each of these things became the premise for what we were going to design. The school had an academic teaching model that was based on the clan system. They also had a diagram of the Thunderbird as a learning model. So all these different cultural principles not only impact the philosophy of how they taught, of how they gathered, how they, what they taught, but also what they wanted their buildings to be like. They had an original master plan that had a building that was shaped like that Thunderbird. And I wanted to step back a little bit and say, okay, how can we honor tradition in a little bit more of a deeper way? We looked at traditional architecture of that community. So these are all images from Leech Lake, and we looked at the history of education on the reservation as well. So from learning from the cradle board, learning from community, to the boarding schools, to the first iteration of the tribal college. So understanding what are the different lessons learned from how do you take a community, how do you take the youth and other people in the community and bring cultural knowledge to them. We set up a series of guiding principles for the project before we even started to design. So there was culture and aesthetics, there was the whole library and academic experience, and then functional issues. And I showed the image on the right because that's about taking care in every craft that you're involved in and really understanding and taking the time to do something right. This is going to build a little bit on the discussions we had last week about how do you site a building. So on the right, you see a little yellow dot where we explored and went through pros and cons about where this small addition to this college would be. We did a lot of preliminary analysis, and what we really realized is we had to actually master plan the entire campus in order to understand where this one new addition, small library would be, because the campus wanted to grow into a much larger facility. So we did a master plan, and that red dot in the middle would allow the library to be built, but that the blue stuff, that the future phases would all work together to tell one campus story. And started to do preliminary. It was very, very low budget. We had existing buildings that had a certain shape and a certain height. And again, the cultural goals here were to change the paradigm of what was existing already. If you see the buildings on the left there, this is a rendering, but the buildings in brown, they were very kind of closed off. There were double loaded corridors, which means that they're a building which has a corridor right in the middle, and you enter rooms on either side. So you get these long, narrow corridors. The original master plan really would have made this feel like more like an 70s elementary school. But what they wanted to do was open this up, respond to the forest, respond to the outside. So we created, you can see on the upper right, a lot of openness, a lot of windows. And again, the approach here wasn't to do the lipstick. It wasn't to paint cultural symbols on top of a box, but it was really to shape the building, shape the inside for cultural gestures. Sustainability was an important piece of this, but it was all about gathering, and it was about creating the best type of place where you could learn and be part of that community. So here was our floor plan, and there's all the necessary stuff in the back of what a library is. But in the front, we really exploded that relationship between the indoors and outdoors by making outdoor reading spaces, by making overhangs, by making, using most of our budget there to create open space and windows to the outside. And so here is that image of that part of the library that opens up to the exterior. And again, from a cultural perspective, you don't look at this and you don't see a symbol. But if you look at the overall master planning, if you look at some of the interior elements, it really talks about the values that the library wanted to convey. And that was that transparency, the openness, the idea of gathering. And that's a very different approach than again, making something incredibly overt from a design perspective. There's a nature center in Minnesota that I designed. First gestural sketches were again coming from, okay, let's make this as open as possible. This was a site that honored both settlers and Dakota history. It's run by the Three Rivers Park District in Minneapolis. But the idea was, how do you build a building in the landscape that really honored the landscape the way, and this is what I brought to it, but the way an Indigenous mindset would be. And it would be, again, taking this open standpoint to really delicately touch the ground. On the right is the nature preserve. On the left is the pathway in from the city. So as the form changed throughout the building, we created a long bar as you enter the building of space. And then on the interior where the exhibits and the views to nature are, it opened up to be more transparent. Again, the problem here was, how do you honor and respond to both of the traditions that were on this farm. This was an original farm. So we started looking at the way the forest was and the light and the materials and the seasons, and started to really want to make the building about how does this nestle into the forest? How does it nestle in and not impact it so it blends in and it doesn't really feel like this foreign Western thing coming into the space. Same thing was with the exhibits that we designed. How do we design them so that they feel like they're actually part of the architecture, so that they're flexible, so that people can have this hands-on interaction with the different pieces. But I'll do this all in a very contemporary way. So this is the exterior as it faces the landscape. Again, the entry, so you enter into more of a rectangular box, but you get hints in the verticality of it all that really this is about the forest and about this inviting gesture of this entryway. This is the side of the building. And then the interiors. So it was all about, again, that creation of light, the use of materials, the response to the exterior, so that it really, again, nestled in. It didn't feel like it was this big box sitting on to the space. I was told by an elder when she heard I was studying architecture, she goes, I don't want to see you designing any boxes. So even on the projects that I work on that aren't specifically Native American, I try to bring a lot of the sensitivity that I get from learning when I do tribal projects. Here's an affordable housing project. This is interesting because it's about a community response really to the homelessness in Minneapolis. Again, here's this image of what Minneapolis should look like. And on the right, in 2018, there was a big homeless encampment that sprung up. And again, how do you respond to these contemporary situations? This isn't a museum, it's not a cultural center, but these are our people. We have to house them. Again, here is the homeless encampment, and it was getting close to winter. And if for those of you who know Minnesota well, this winter we got down to negative 20 something in Minneapolis, and so we were racing. The community was racing to try to find an architectural design solution for the people. Again, some images of what was happening here. So we first made an emergency response by putting up what is called a navigation center, so a homeless shelter, essentially, that was sprung structures. And so we put in beds and cultural places in here. We put teepees, and this was the response that's what we could get up. And we got it up like right before the biggest freeze. So our goal here was to save lives in this first immediate part of this project. Luckily, I know a lot of artists in the community, and we put art all over the place. We put a teepee inside there. Inside, we put other cultural elements. So this was a way of inserting culture and making a gesture in this emergency response. And then as part of this, we designed on the same site, we took down those things, and right now we're constructing a affordable housing project. And this is kind of a preliminary rendering, but this is on the site where that homeless shelter, that emergency homeless shelter was built. And so the idea here, again, a low budget project, but we're trying to really make this from a functional perspective, cultural, that there is services, there's clinics, there is the Red Lake Nation Embassy is in here, there are community spaces, the exterior and the interior start to talk about culture. So what we try to do from a design perspective was make a connection to the Indigenous landscape. And this was funded by the Red Lake Nation. And so we were trying to look at what are the aspects of culture that we could bring into this urban setting. And so bringing the colors and the forms and the shapes of the Red Lake Nation and their homelands into the building. And again, this is a affordable housing project, but if you look at a lot of them that are built, especially the ones for disadvantaged communities, there's not a whole lot of effort put into design or the cultural thought process. But we really wanted to take the elements like the birch, bring it in the colors, the idea of gathering around the fire and cooking. So this project really, in a very subtle way, but important way, brought culture for the homeless population in Minneapolis. So we've gone from a library to a nature center to a housing project. We also do gaming facilities, and they're sort of kind of on the either end of the spectrum of tribal projects, the small jewel projects, and then the large giant gaming projects. But culture was really important to this tribe. And so how do you create this idea of this Las Vegas bling in an urban setting and really make it a cultural response? So again, the first thing we did was involve the community. We worked with cultural leaders to understand what their goals are, what their history was. This is an urban tribe, so they're right in this harbor out in Washington, in Tacoma, very industrial site. But you can see in the background is Mount Rainier, and they're in the birthplace of their community. So that tribe essentially existed from this waterway, this sound to that mountain, and there was a river that connected them. So they really wanted to, make that tie to their traditional homelands. We looked at their cultural practices. What are their contemporary cultural practices? What are their first foods? What did this landscape that they lived in, what did it bring to them? What are the cultural activities that are both traditional and contemporary that might inform the project? What are material culture, baskets, patterns, colors, clothing, architecture that can inform the design process? And again, how do you do that in this jumble of highways in a modern setting near Seattle? So this was our site. It was an urban grid. We had multiple blocks that we had to build around. It was really important to them to have that view to the water, view to Mount Rainier, which is again their homeland. So again, this is their territory, from that mountain to the water and the river that connected them. And they really wanted to make this their cultural statement. Again, it's a gaming project, so very large. It had an event center, parking, hotel. But we organized the different zones of the building into those important cultural places for them: the mountain, the river, and the sound. And each of the elements in those areas responded to some sort of design, some sort of natural feature color that existed in each of those parts of their territory. And again, this was to, when you do architecture, you have to find some way to create this idea of form and make a decision-making process. And culture really helped us in that decision-making process. This is an early rendering of their lobby. They wanted their lobby to not be a typical casino, but really make it more like a museum. And so we put areas for contemporary artists to display stuff, the ceiling and the rings and the wall. That all is an abstraction that tells their creation story. And we didn't make it too overt so that it was, in your face, but they can bring their dignitaries or people into the building and use the architecture and the elements to tell their creation story. And again, this is a gaming project, so it has its own character. It has to have that kind of sparkle and bling to it. But how do you do that from a cultural standpoint? This is the high limit area. How do we make a series of elegance using the idea of the cedar and the forest? This is a small deli, and this was in the mountain zone. So we looked at that from a perspective of, how did they use the traditional resources in there? We used traditional art on the walls and contemporary art. So we were gathering the culture, we were gathering the colors, the textures, the patterns, all culturally based, but creating a deli, a 24-hour spot in a gaming facility. This is a restaurant we designed that is on the other side of that space, where it responds to the sound and the water and the way they utilize that. So we used baskets, the baskets they used along the water. We used driftwood. We used materials that all existed in culture. The artwork, again, told cultural stories. So again, not a museum, but very culturally informed restaurant space. Their first gaming facility was a paddle wheel, so we made an homage to that. And then in their main event center gathering space, we took cues from their traditional gathering spaces. So the longhouse and the wood and the cedar that was involved in all of that. And again, it was all about telling that cultural story. And again, the reason why I'm including a gaming project is that you can utilize culture in everything that we're doing from a design standpoint. So there it is, Las Vegas bling in Tacoma that is highly culturally contextual. Here's another hotel resort area. This one's in North Carolina. Very, very different setting. It's along a river in the mountains. And again, it has some cultural facilities in it. It has hotel, it has gathering spaces, but they wanted to respond to their landscape and their architecture. So again, we did all this research. What is the typical settling patterns along a river for the Eastern Band of Cherokee? What were the traditional forms? And we started to sculpt the building. You can see on the left and on the right that honoring of those forms, but not really mimicking them to a certain extent, but it helped us start to generate this idea of how do you respond to both the curves of the mountains and the curves of the landscape to give this a very, very unique feeling. On the right on the image, there's a waterfall feature that has 7 waterfalls, and that tells very subtly their creation story. And that reappears in multiple places in their facility. So again, in a casino, we took and created very culturally specific areas. And what this allowed both of those projects to do was to really make them highly unique facilities. It does not look like a casino. It does not look like anything that was done before. So there's that inventiveness and creativity in design that we can make. And then here's a study for another addition. So again, different scales. How do you deal with culture from a small, tiny building to a large kind of sprawling campus of buildings? So we took, this was an addition and an expansion to this facility. So we took what you see on the left, which is a very typical kind of 80s casino, and then made it something very soft and sculptural and warm and inviting, all based on their cultural practices. So those are the projects that I'm going to show you. And again, I guess to summarize, cultural identity is incredibly important. It matters to all of our tribes. I know it matters, it's incredibly important in my community, whether it's in Minneapolis or whether it's on the reservation. Working with tribes around the country, I don't go in, even as a Native person, I don't go and tell people, I know what you need to do. I'm going to be your designer, because that was the paternalistic white father architecture approach to design. but I do have the experience to talk and to generate a discussion that helps each community define and design their own projects. So again, if you're working with a non-native architect or a team that doesn't know your culture, make sure that there's that community engagement process that opens up the dialogue, and that really this project is yours. You're the ultimate designer. And again, I can draw and I can translate ideas into what eventually will be construction documents that the contractor kind of ignores anyway sometimes. But eventually the whole process it starts from you. It starts from the community. You have a vision, and some of you have the ability to see spatially. Some of you have the ability to understand and plan. And some of you probably will look at a floor plan and boom, I can't look at this, it hurts my eyes. But your words are going to be incredibly important to the design process. And even if you can't draw or design, you telling the story that you want to tell and what you want to convey is going to be incredibly important to make that jump from that story to a building. And again, this series of webinars is all part of this continuous process from day one of having a vision to then understanding and really self-reflecting about what does the community want from this? Do we want this to tell a traditional story of our resiliency and how we've held on to tradition? Or do you want to tell, we're contemporary, we're looking toward the next 500 years, and we want this building to tell the story of a sophisticated, urban professional group of people. And again, it's going to depend on each project, and that's why I showed you multiple different types of projects, because there's a similar process with each of them, and it's about design thinking. It's about taking an idea. It's about defining the goals. It's about testing and starting to sketch, to start to come up with ideas. Then it's about refining it, doing the imagery, and having that constant dialogue. So what you don't want your architect to do is to come to your community, have a workshop or two, and then come back 3 months later with a final design. That's absolutely the wrong process, because you want to be part of this. You're going to live in this building. You're going to work in it. Your children are going to see it. Your family members. So each building that we do has the ability for a different type of architectural expression, but they're all important to building what is the overall community of our either our reservations or our urban communities or wherever it is that we are living. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions or comments.
Hi, good morning, afternoon. This is Jessica Winstaffer with Chicxulub Native Village, and thank you for that really fun tour of so many Indigenous contemporary designs that you just shared. A question has kind of come up in our discussions between last week and this week, and this may not be the right time to ask it, but it's really about how do we at Chicxulub Native Village take the next steps that we need to in our process, and as Melissa Shaganoff has explained and Selena has also explained, we're really at an early stage. We don't have an architect. We don't have a lot of the planning background that we want to have, but we do have 3 of us now on this call, plus this commitment to this year with all of you, and part of our tribal transportation program funding can help with planning. And so we have some money, and the sum is kind of ambiguous, but I'd really like to discuss with our council today. They're having a council meeting right now upstairs, approving us to move forward with potentially a request for proposals on the first step that we need. And so, we've talked over these last I don't know, 6 weeks or so, strategic planning organization wise, strategic planning facility, master planning for like all the future facilities we might want, and then really specific site planning and now design. So with all of that, where should we start? And we really don't want to waste our time and our money going down the wrong paths, because we do have this 1 year with you, or now less than a year, to try to really get us to a significant end result. And the bigger picture is that we want to ask some federal agencies that are doing federal highways, that's doing highway projects here in really critical cultural sites, to fund a cultural center. So we think that if we had a conceptual design and the site, and a lot of this pre-work that we're talking about, we actually could have a funder. But we're also, there's like a couple of years in which we could ask for this. So we don't want to dawdle, I guess.
Well, I guess the first thing is that every project is different. So there's no like, and we've shown some diagrams in some of these presentations that show this nice clean response, and then Dee had this diagram where he scribbled all over the place, and that's kind of more about what reality is like. But that reality, think of it as a roller coaster. And if you like roller coasters, think of it as a roller coaster. If you don't like roller coasters, don't think of it as roller coaster. But it's a fun process. It's cyclical, but it's cyclical this way. So the important thing is that there's a consistency in the people who are like spearheading it. And that's where the first thing I would say is establish a team, or at least a point person in the community that will survive an election, survive, changes in staff, someone who's can be there for the long haul. So that's one piece of it. And I'm not saying this because I'm an architect, but get an architect involved early on, and even a contractor, at least to some small degree. And it could just be a meeting, because the contractors and the architects know what's going to happen at the other end of it. So instead of going in all sorts of different ways, we can at least funnel the process a little bit to get you to the point of, all right, what are the steps that you can take to get to that point? I often get asked this question. Well, we often get RFPs and we get selected for a project, and they're nowhere near ready to have a building, because they don't know what their organizational structure is. They don't know how they're going to fund their operations. They don't have a site. They don't, there's many different things that happens. And we start the project and we say, okay, well, here's what we see as a potential path for you guys, a couple alternates for your getting this project done. And we talk to them, and then we go away for a year, and then they're ready, and they do feasibility analysis, they do their pro formas, they do the due diligence that needs to happen there. I always love the encouragement to, like, all right, let's start drawing some blueprints. But first of all, blueprints don't exist anymore. But the idea to, like, let's dive in and make this real. I love that sort of optimism and enthusiasm, and whatever you can do to build and then maintain momentum. It's kind of easy to get people excited about a project. It might be harder to maintain momentum over time. So some of this is about timing, but you have to understand who you are first as an organization, to at least a certain extent, to understand what we want to be. Again, I would question these labels of what a museum or a community center is, because it's different for every community. A library is a community center. A museum is a library. It's and a lot of these places are also funeral homes, and there's many different overlapping things that are happening there. So it's sort of understanding a little bit about who you want to be and who you are, in whatever capacity it is you guys can do so, And that's done through either just kind of, 5-year strategic planning. I've seen that has been resulted in some good steps forward. Some organizations have a planner come in, and planner is a nebulous word, but they'll have a planner come in who will either help you with some of the visioning and actually do some of the financial calculations. Do you need a gift store? Do you need, where are you going to get your source of revenue? Usually what happens is you can fund a project for the first 5 years, and then year 5, all your grants go somewhere else or some sort of funding. So how are you going to be able to generate revenue on this project? So again, there's no real one answer here, but it's starting a discussion with the right people in the room at the right time. And I would encourage you to have your organizational leaders, the community, maybe your tribal council or a representative, other cultural leaders, potential funders are always good to have in the room, and have your architect and maybe a contractor. Mm-hmm. And at least you can start the discussion by, we have all these ideas, how do we start to funnel them down into a path that has traction and can maintain momentum? And John and Dee, please jump in here, because there's experiences all over the place.
Yeah, we've certainly seen challenges with projects like this that are inevitably take years to accomplish. And for tribal communities that sometimes have a quick administrative turnover, we've realized the importance in having a series of well-planned tribal resolutions throughout the process, which makes it more difficult to do the 1 step forward and 2 steps back. The tribal resolutions throughout the process enable the changing administrations to continue on that path that you set forward. So that's been our biggest lesson learned.
I would agree. And can you hear me, Sam?
Yeah.
Great presentation. The result is so important that the process becomes more important as you feel the pressure to move forward without maybe understanding or communicating or believing maybe what is being told. I would encourage you to stop and look at it. It was one of my privileges to attend and be a part of a conference, Construction in Indian Country, down in Phoenix, Arizona, and the keynote speaker was Dr. John Molina, an MD that was practicing out of Alaska, and is currently now living in, he is the director of health systems, and he's living in Arizona. But he told a story of building a medical facility, state of the art, and it was beautiful. It just streamlined. It had everything new. Everything was beautiful. And after it opened, he was surprised at the health of his community, of the community he was serving. People weren't getting well in a factor that he thought they would have with this fine facility. And he started looking at it, and the facility had nothing that spoke to the community in it. And once they established culture, texture, color that made people feel like the community was speaking to them, then they started healing faster. And you would think science is science, but how you live, how your heart beats, how the heartbeat of your cultural center beats, it should follow the heartbeat of your community. And you're the best to know what that is. So I would encourage you to have the right result at the final, is spend the time now, as Sam's talking about, and communicate, be part of it. And to, if you don't feel like you understand a step in the process, raise your hand, because guaranteed there's others in your community that don't either. And it's so important to have your story told in your place. That's what I would add.
Great.
That was really great. Do we have any other questions?
So this again, I hope I paused long enough to let somebody else jump in if they want to. I appreciate the professional and Indigenous perspectives that are brought through these presentations. And I guess the presenters come from different companies and different backgrounds, but is it appropriate to develop a plan and send it to the different represented here, or is there some code I'm breaking if I do that? Because while there may be some people in Alaska, we haven't worked with them yet that have these perspectives. We've attempted to work with our local architects and we've built things, but they're just not quite, we haven't gone back far enough, I think, in the planning of the entire perspective to get such a great end result. So I guess the question might be for Melissa or Susan, like, is it okay if we reach out to the presenters to develop some sort of contract or otherwise?
I would say that's up to them. We would encourage you to, because obviously we admire and appreciate these architects. So they would all come highly recommended by us to you and to any of you. So whatever you and they would like to do is perfectly fine with us. But I wanted to make sure that you had your question answered, because are you planning to approach your tribal council today to ask them about something? And if so, what were you intending to ask?
Well, we want to give them an update on attending these webinars and keep them in the loop. They've approved us participating in this cohort before we even applied. So they know about it, but we want to keep them, as you mentioned, keep that momentum going. And so communicate with them at their monthly meetings, even if it's a very brief update. But we've had a cultural committee meeting in the last week where we discussed some of those initial facility discussions on what do we want, how do we, just amongst a small group, we want to bring that to tribal council. But also in this near, last week or two, it's become my attention, we might have funding from one of our other departments, the Tribal Transportation Program, to help with some financial resources with the planning effort. And so it's really trying to bring all the deciders and the visionaries together to give us some direction and approval to spend money.
Yeah, and I would just say too, thank you, Jessica, for that, because I was thinking the exact same thing. I was just like, oh, can we hire these people to do ours? Because, I think too that this idea of the museum, and Sam, you've returned to it a couple of times, that that everybody has like a different perspective of what a museum is for communities, and I think that there's a little bit of confusion, and I know that these are recorded and somehow shared, and that's maybe another discussion. But I really think like this presentation today would be a good one to send to our to have our tribal council view in the future. But yeah, I think today we're going to talk to them about this project and this idea that there's going to be some sort of visioning after, and like what does that look like in action, right? Because I think that right now it's also theoretical. It's just being at least for the council. I don't want to speak for them, but that's the perspective that I hear when talking to them, of being like, okay, the sky is the limit, let's dream up everything. But at the same time, like what we can actually do in the next 5 years, 10 years, I think is important. I guess that sort of my question is like, how do you focus in on developing, the mission, with a group of people who, when you're talking about a museum, it can be so many different things. Like, how do you how do you work through that? Like I was going through the questions, you know, and just thinking like I should just answer these and then find a way to sort of interview each person individually, because that's going to be the only way that we're really going to get, I think, answers, you know, which is a lot of work. But I don't know, do you guys have any sort of perspective on like, you know, getting to the mission, you know, seeing those screenshots? Yeah.
What you all heard from Art Wolf earlier in the series, and I'm actually in the midst of a major planning process for a museum with him right now. And it's been typically in a non-COVID moment, it would be a series of workshops and stakeholder interviews. This is can be a long, complex project process to develop that mission and vision. But we're having for this museum system, which is a municipal museum system, not a tribal museum, we're meeting on a weekly basis with the entire staff of actually 4 different museums. And they're given a series of homework assignments every week and they meet in small groups and they craft versions of mission statements and vision statements and values. And now we're into strategic goals and objectives. And then they kind of reconvene and wordsmith them and combine them together. But it's pretty important that happens. You have a facilitator, but a strategic plan, a mission statement, a vision statement will only work if you are the ones who have crafted those statements. A facilitator can help get you there and guide you through a consensus building approach, but they really have to come from your hearts. One thing I'd like to add to Jessica's discussion about hiring an architect. One of the things you all are in different communities around the country and very different climates. Alaska probably first and foremost in terms of difference from where I practice. And so when you're hiring an architect, and I gave a whole webinar on hiring an architect, and somehow that didn't think to include this, but we very often work in partnership. And we find that works really well, having a local architect and a subject matter architect. And sometimes we're the local and not the subject matter expert, and sometimes we're the subject matter expert and working with a local. And that partnership is, we find, really essential to success for many, many projects.
Jessica and everyone, I wanted to mention to you that Art Wolf, the person who's helping with strategic planning, will be contacting you individually and will be available to help you address any of your individual needs. And that, I think, is true of everybody that we're working with on this project, because we're here to help you. You just need to let us know if you have specific or unique needs, and we'll try our best to address those. Just be prepared for Art's call. And Jessica, if you need his help immediately, we'll have him call you right away. Does that help? Great.
I don't know that I need his phone call immediately, but I appreciate the discussion and the guidance. So yeah, I don't think that fire is burning at this moment, but the big picture in terms of what are the steps we need to do is full right now.
Okay. Well, just any of you, let us know what you need, and we'll do our best to help.
Yeah, I'm sure Dee and Sean and myself, the reason why we're on this whole effort is because we love what we do. And we've done it enough to still love what we do, which is kind of crazy sometimes. But you know, over time, you gain some experience and lessons learned about the community engagement process and about the tribal government process. And so again, there's no one way to do a project at all, because every time we start a project, it goes in different directions we couldn't have possibly imagined, which is part of the fun of it all. But all 3 of us are here as a resource to you, and if you want to contact us, I'm sure Dean Sean, we're perfectly willing to help talk you through things. And it might be just to the point of, okay, I think you need an owner's rep, or maybe you need a facilitated visioning or strategic planning session, or maybe you're ready to send out an RFP. You guys are probably all at different timeframes. We often help potential clients write RFPs, and so there's a lot of experience you can gain from the collective wisdom in the room. And I would encourage somehow when we get together in person that we all share these stories about what we're doing, because you guys can learn from each other as well. Every project I learn, I'm humbled every time I try to do a project because of what I learn all the time. So.
Another thing I'd say is one of the reasons I'm here is to help. If there's anything I can do to help with your confidence in this process, having confidence of what you're doing and believing in yourself is so critical, because it's your story, like we've said, to be told. So if there's any questions you have, I'm sure that I'm speaking for Sam and Sean. There's no question that we wouldn't entertain and say that is too simple. This is all about communication and, like I said, building confidence in the process and expectation in the result.
Okay, well, that was wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, Sam, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I know that Susan would agree with me, but we feel so fortunate that all of you are part of this cohort and that we're all willing to work together and help each other. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing.
It's like Laura and Joan have their hands up.
Oh,
Laura clapping.
Clapping. Joan's clapping. Ah, very nice.
We should all do that. How do you do that?
Learn something new, don't we?
I'll have to check that one out.
I just want to say, Nixon, thank you so much. This was really useful. I got some lingo to use, because I think the biggest stuff I'm looking forward to is that community engagement. I want to hear, when we get past some of this training, but being able to really outreach to the community for that input, to really know, okay, I know we need a facility here. We need something to help house our culture, to tell our story, and to preserve it for our future generations. But I can't wait till we get to that point for the community engagement, so we can really build something beautiful that represents us. So today was really good. Some of the things I'm taking away is, what's your cultural statement? What do you want people to know when they come to this new creation that we're going to be looking forward to building? And also, who's like your dream team? Trying to think of who do we really need at the table. So, but thank you. It was good.
One last piece of advice for community engagement: serve food.
That is really good advice. Everything can go wrong, but if you take care of people and treat them with hospitality, they forget what goes wrong. So it's important. Any other questions on this? And because we have a few details that we would like to discuss with you. Sean, fried bread. Sean, did you have something to add? I think Melissa sent you some dates last week that we proposed for the trip. We're hoping that everything is okay and that everybody's available to travel then, and that it will be safe to travel. So does anybody have any concerns or any comments that you would like to make on that trip, about that trip?
I'm not sure I saw the date. What were the dates again?
So we were looking at September 16th, that you would leave your home and you'd return back on September 24th. And Susan, I'm not sure, we do have one of our facilities in Oklahoma that we're kind of working with around some of their opening stuff. And so there's a small chance we may consider the next week in September. And if that doesn't work for someone, let us know. So that would be like the 23rd through the 1st. And of course, the architects you guys would not be coming in till either the 19th or the 26th. So don't worry about that earlier in the week.
The first part of the trip is spent in DC at the National Museum of the American Indians Resource Center, looking at collections that are available to you for long-term loans. We thought it would be good to start there so that it might help inform some of your design decisions if you see what's available. And so from DC, you'll fly directly to Oklahoma City, and we would first tour the new American Indian Cultural Center. I think they changed their name though.
First American
Museum. And then we would go on to the Citizen Potawatomi, which is a mid-size location that has a library and an archive, a veterans gallery, some good community gathering spaces. And from there we would go on to the Chickasaw Nation, which has a lot of great exterior spaces as well as great interior ones and a nice auditorium. And then from there we go on to the Choctaw Nation Museum, which is new. And in fact, it's scheduled to open the week that we're there. So that's kind of what we want to show you while you're here. I think that they're all very inspiring. They all have stories to tell and lessons to share. So that's what we were planning for that trip. Do you have any questions about that?
How many people for each community are permitted to come?
2.
2? Thank you.
We'll pay for 2.
Okay.
If you want to bring more, let's discuss it. So, and we'll have a large 55 passenger coach. So there's capacity, but we want everybody to be comfortable as well. And the architects will be there, and we thought we would spend the evenings just in discussion with them. And you can ask them questions, share your designs. They might want to do a few sketches. And Sam I see a bunch of chats down here, which I can't see the chat, Melissa.
I got it. Okay. Sam replied back. So Sam.
Pardon?
Oh, Tim, we were just talking about what you had put in the chat.
Yeah, okay.
There was a question
Can
about.
you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just, this is something that is of concern to me. You want to have that community input, and like was stated, you don't just have an architect come in, have a couple of meetings, then come back with a design a few months later, but yet you need to keep momentum. And what I'm wondering about now is the process that we laid out for strategic planning in our IMLS proposal. Is Art on this call, by the way?
Don't see him.
I don't think he's on today, no.
Okay. Anyway, in the beginning we'll be having a retreat and then listening sessions in each of the 6 reservation districts. And then later on there will be a couple of community meetings to kind of explain the findings and then to help participate in some design. But I wonder if we have enough community input yet. Again, there's the momentum question. So if maybe somebody wants to, Sam or whoever could respond to that.
I think the idea of that balance between an architect going away and working on their own stuff without input and having that momentum is simply just to have the regular meetings, to have this be a process that's inclusive and that you meet regularly. I noted in the chat that you need to celebrate progress, celebrate your successes, and present to the community. So there's, my mind just buzzing with a bunch of lessons learned on all this, but the killer of momentum is someone not being involved in the process, who has authority coming in and saying, no, I didn't want it this way, and then you're back to the drawing board. That's what you want to, that's one of the things you want to avoid. On the flip side of that is that you want people to be excited and want to be part of it, show them the importance of whatever facilities you're doing, how important it is to their children and grandchildren and the community overall. So it's about just having, once you get started, to just make sure that something is always happening, and you have a set of to-dos and things ahead of you that people are working toward from that shared vision.
Part of me wants to say you can't have too many community meetings, but I know that that's not true, because they do, it costs money, and it can't, depending on the process and where your funding is coming from, it can extend the process, which in an ideal world would be perfect. But there are budgets to be considered and timelines that have to be followed. So you do have to take care with that. I think it's really important when you are developing your community engagement process that you think through how community engagement has worked or not worked with past projects in your community, that you try to anticipate the loud voices that will be coming to the meetings and the roadblocks that people will inevitably put up in the face of development. And you need to help the architect understand where those challenges are going to come. The idea that the architect is going to be able to make every person in the community happy is probably not so true. And we need to be very careful in how we set community expectations with that process. And I think that's part of the art of what Sam and Dee and I do is listen to the community, hear what they say, demonstrate what you've heard, how you've learned from it, and start to put those lessons into physicality. But we can't realize everything. And so we need your help understanding your community, how decisions are made traditionally, how decisions are made practically, so that we can really set expectations.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Sean, because I think one of the biggest things is to include cultural leaders and see what the traditional process. I alluded that in my presentation, that there's a cultural, integrating cultural values into the design process is really important. And that's incredibly important. The other piece of this that I would just comment on is the architects are probably hesitating from giving you a roadmap, not because we haven't been down many roads or know how to pave some roads ahead of us, but each community is different. And Sean was right in saying we have to understand. And then once we have this basic knowledge of where you're at and what are the structures, we can help you navigate that. One quick lesson learned is there's a difference between a community engagement session where you're soliciting input and when you're doing an open house to show progress. And there's different ways to facilitate that to allow for people to stand up and say things or people to mingle around, and there's just different ways of gathering and meeting that can align more with the results that you're hoping to get out of that meeting.
During the shutdown of the recent couple months, my family has been really enjoying the show Parks and Recreation. And if you don't know it, it's a really funny show about municipal management and a great primer in how not to run a community meeting, because there's show after show after show of really bad community meetings, but worth a watch and a laugh.
I'd like to add that there's different scales of community meetings and community interaction, and I think that's something that has been alluded to. But like Sam was saying, is expectations with overall communities of progress versus true workshops. But I've also seen that it's been effective to have community representation and leaders that represent the community at smaller work groups, and we've had them referred to as work groups by some of the communities, to where you meet with a work group, and in this particular case, we did meet with a work group whose task was the cultural aspects of the community to help guide some of the decision making. We did meet with the business council individually as well, and then we would report sometimes to the community meetings once every month to give a progress, but it was always more successful if the groups that we were meeting with, the cultural group, would speak up and speak from their hearts so that there could be built consensus within the community. Because we would have to have those points and times along the process to where there would be a vote of consensus. And with that type of process, it's a story that grows out of the community. It's a project that grows out of community, and we're always listening at the different levels. But sometimes it is total community, sometimes it's representative groups, and other times it's going straight to the business leaders, the business council, to speak. So there's different types of conversations, there's different types of interactions, and through that all, it's something that you should have in the process, I think, to make sure that people are comfortable. Everybody's heard stories from people that are trying to speak, and what we want to do is make sure that you hear an honest process of what you're going through, because the result is really important.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Susan, did you have anything else that you wanted to discuss?
No, any other questions? We've been on a lot longer than we thought we would, but great questions. And but maintaining momentum is important in any project. So that was a great question, Tim. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation.
All right. Well, we will see you all next week.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you.